The story kicks off in 1996, when a news report looks back at the mysterious hero, who had secretly been protecting Earth for years. According to the journalist, the world had no idea that someone, known as the Green Lantern, was watching over them, until he finally revealed himself in spectacular fashion, by stopping a massive meteor that was on course to destroy Victoria Falls. Across town, a group of teenagers watches the historic broadcast on television, as Hal Jordan officially introduces himself to the world as the first Green Lantern. Among those watching are brothers John Stewart and Marcus. While John remains completely focused on the interview, he tells Marcus to keep an eye on the window so they don't get caught. But their plan quickly falls apart when their father returns home. The other kids immediately scatter, while John stays glued to the television. Just before his father enters the room, John quickly switches it off and tries to act innocent. Their father, however, already knows exactly what they were watching, and since he's a military man, he decides to test his son's courage in a rather unusual way. He sends John outside and then approaches John with an apple. John places the apple on top of his head, as his father takes aim with his weapon. Despite the danger, John stands perfectly still. Afterward, his father embraces him, seemingly satisfied that his son isn't easily frightened. The story then jumps forward 20 years to 2016, as John is now older and has been undergoing intense training to become a backup Green Lantern. After finishing another exhausting session, he's frustrated when Hal finally shows up to pick him up. Hal looks tired, disheveled, and clearly isn't in the best condition. Hal apologizes for arriving so late, but he's surprised when John doesn't immediately lose his temper. As the two talk, we discover that John has spent nearly 3 months preparing for this responsibility. Hal, meanwhile, has been practically impossible to reach. John still hasn't even been allowed to wear the ring, despite believing that the Guardians selected him for a reason. Then Hal does something completely unexpected. He removes the Green Lantern ring from his finger, places it on the dashboard, and casually tells John that he'll see him at a nearby taco stand. Before John can properly process what just happened, Hal jumps out of the vehicle, forcing John to grab the ring and put it on himself. Moments later, the vehicle crashes off the road. Fortunately, John survived the incident furious. He calls his father and explains that Hal seemingly tried to kill him. His father, however, isn't convinced that Hal actually intended to harm him, and believes the whole thing may have been some kind of extreme training exercise. John is still furious, especially after everything he's been put through. That's when something even stranger happens. The younger version of Hal suddenly appears before him. John soon realizes that this isn't actually the real Hal, but a backup version of Jordan's consciousness that has been preserved as a sentient holographic program. Meanwhile, the real Hal is nowhere near the crash site. He's busy enjoying himself with other people, before eventually settling down for a drink. Not long afterward, John tracks him down. Still angry about what happened, he walks over and hands the ring back to Hal. John then reveals something unexpected. Hal's backup consciousness had sent a message to him. The younger version of Jordan wanted his present self to remember one important detail. There's hail coming down in Rushville, Nebraska. Hal immediately realizes that something is wrong. Without wasting another second, he takes off and heads straight for Rushville. John unfortunately has no choice but to follow by plane. When John finally reaches the scene in Rushville, the police immediately stop him from entering, as the area has been sealed off, and civilians aren't allowed anywhere near it. However, after some time, John is eventually given clearance to proceed inside. He quickly finds Hal and confronts him for leaving him behind earlier. John points out that Hal had arrived in the area nearly 6 hours ago. Their conversation is interrupted when Sheriff Carrie approaches. It's obvious from her attitude that she doesn't appreciate their presence, especially since neither of them has any official jurisdiction over the investigation as they discuss the situation. Carrie immediately shuts down Howell's theory that the mass shooting could somehow be connected to aliens. She clearly isn't interested in entertaining what she considers an unbelievable explanation. Once the sheriff walks away, Hal and John begin examining the crowd. One particular bystander catches their attention, and the two start wondering if he might actually be something more than he appears. So John approaches Carrie with their suspicion. Although she's reluctant, the sheriff eventually agrees to keep an eye on the man. Unfortunately, the suspect realizes that he's being watched and suddenly takes off running, and John immediately gives chase. What follows is a long pursuit through the area, with the suspect doing everything possible to escape. After an exhausting chase, John finally manages to catch up with him and knocks him unconscious, allowing Carrie to place him in handcuffs. A moment later, Hal shows up and insists that he should be allowed to interrogate the suspect himself. Carrie refuses, making it clear that Hal has no authority to question her prisoner. Later, Hal and John head to a bar for a drink, and their conversation eventually turns back to the mysterious Green Lantern ring. John wants to know exactly how Hal obtained it, but Hal avoids giving him a straight answer instead. He acts as though John should already know the story behind it. While they continue talking, Hal repeatedly changes the music playing throughout the bar. His behavior quickly starts irritating everyone around him, but that seems to be exactly what he wants. Just then, John realizes what Hal is trying to accomplish. Hal deliberately wants to get into a fight and end up behind bars. His plan is simple if he gets arrested. He'll have excuse to stay close to the suspected alien. At the police station, John thinks the whole idea is ridiculous. But Hal has already made up his mind as I'll put his plan into action. John notices that Hal has left the ring behind. While holding it, he catches the attention of a woman at the bar, who becomes curious about what he's looking at. John explains that Earth normally has only one Green Lantern at a time, and he's being prepared as a replacement, in case anything happens to Hal. The conversation between John and the woman becomes increasingly personal. While Hal's plan works perfectly, he gets into a fight, takes a serious beating, and eventually the police arrive to arrest him. With Hal now in custody, the woman asks John to walk her to her truck, and their interaction soon turns romantic. The following morning, John heads to the police station intending to bail Hal out. But when he arrives, Sheriff Carey reveals that things haven't gone exactly as planned. Hal is furious because Carey figured out his entire scheme. She realized that he intentionally wanted to get arrested, so she would have no choice but to keep him in the same place as the suspected alien. John asks if he can simply take Hal home, but Carey explains that she can't release him until after his arraignment. Eventually, Hal is brought before a judge and formally charged with 8 counts of aggravated assault, along with resisting arrest. Despite everything that happened, Hal maintains that he's not guilty. He insists that his only intention was to question the suspected alien, something Sheriff Carey deliberately prevented him from doing. Just as the situation seems to be getting worse, a lawyer named William Meakin suddenly arrives and claims that he's there to represent Hal. Meakin asks the court to simply impose a fine and move on. The judge initially agrees, setting Howell's bail at $100,000. But when Howell complains about the amount, the judge isn't amused and doubles the bail to $200,000. Surprisingly, the money isn't an issue, as Meakin reveals that Hal's father has already agreed to cover the bail. Apparently, he's a massive Green Lantern fan and is more than willing to pay the bill. But there's just one condition, as he only wants Hal to have dinner with him. However, we get to find out that William Meakin is actually Sheriff Carey's husband. After exchanging a few pleasantries, John will head over to meet the rest of the Meakin family. William explains that his father is already waiting for them in the kitchen before Hal leaves. He has a brief conversation with Carey over a drink. Carey warns him that her father-in-law has already done some digging into Hal's background, despite the fact that they've never even met. She makes it clear that he's not someone Hal would want to owe a favor to, but Hal isn't interested in backing down, as he sticks to his plan and eventually meets Will in the kitchen, where he's busy preparing food. Hal immediately asks why Will was willing to spend so much money. Getting him out of trouble, Will doesn't hesitate with his answer. He explains that everything changed after the strange alien incident that occurred earlier. While the two men continue their conversation, John is approached by the woman he met the previous night. She introduces herself as Zoe McKen, Carey's mother-in-law and William's mother. Later that night, Will tells Howell and reveals that he's already spoken to Carey. She has agreed to let Howell question the mysterious suspect. Howell, however, remains suspicious because he still hasn't figured out exactly what Will wants from him. Will then explains his motivation. 2 of his boys were nearly killed during the shooting, involving unidentified men, and he wants answers about what really happened. Before leaving, Will makes an unexpected remark to John that suggests he already knows about John's encounter with his wife. Hal is immediately impressed by how much enjoyment John has had, especially considering they've only been in Rushville for about a day. The following morning, Hal finally gets brought up to speed on the suspect, including his background and the organization he supposedly works for. Carey's investigation has convinced her that the man is completely human, but Hal strongly disagrees. He's convinced that there's something unusual about the suspect, and confidently tells Carey that he can get the truth out of him. Carey agrees to let Hal conduct the interrogation, but she gives him a strict warning if he lays a hand on the suspect. She will send him straight back before the judge. Hal enters the interrogation room and begins speaking with the man. Surprisingly, their conversation starts off casually, with the two even discussing football and other ordinary topics. But eventually, things take a dramatic turn, as the suspect finally reveals his true nature. Hal immediately presses him for answers, demanding to know why an extraterrestrial being has come to Earth. Instead of answering, the alien suddenly unleashes a powerful burst of energy. Hal reacts quickly and tries to contain the blast, but the force is far greater than he anticipated. Despite the chaos, everyone survives the incident. The story then makes another major time jump. Moving forward to 2026, John is now traveling through a strangely quiet and nearly deserted Rushville, Nebraska. The town looks completely different from what it was years earlier. Eventually, John meets up with Carey and the two walk together, where they finally come across Hal, except this time he's dead. The episode 1 of Lantern then came to an end. Kindly subscribe for more episodes next week. Thanks for watching and goodbye.